Welcome to Psychology, the Daf. We are in Gemara Eruvin on Daf Mem Zayin. And in today's Gemara, we're going to delve deeply into an unusual custom that was apparently, at least according to some Rishonim, designed to forestall wedding night trauma. Now let's talk about what's wedding night trauma. Wedding night trauma is where you take a chassan and kala who, for different reasons, may have some difficulty or fears regarding being intimate together, which of course everybody has, especially for the first time, but the extent of their difficulty leads to more shame, more embarrassment, anxiety, oftentimes extensive pain during intercourse, and all kinds of other terrible things. Sometimes it's mild and sometimes it is extreme and can go on for months and even years, because once you have a bad experience and you're anxious, it could lead to continuously painful and difficult associations. I like to tell people, imagine if one Pesach you were told that instead of doing the mitzvah of eating matzah, Eliyahu came, and this year, because of a Horah Shah, you're going to eat a ham and rye sandwich doing Heseva, and that's how you're going to do the mitzvah of Pesach this year. Any normal person, no matter how much they would believe in the commandment from Eliyahu Hanavi, would have difficulty swallowing that ham and rye sandwich, and probably would choke on it. So that's what wedding night can be for many people who their whole lives the opposite sex is forbidden, and sexuality is forbidden, and then to jump right into it. Now, the Gemara here, as we're going to see, really discusses a custom that they had, and in this custom, it seems, as I said, according to some Rishonim, a way to forestall and deal with wedding night trauma. So let's take a look. So the Gemara over here mentions that according to Rabbi Yehuda, in a place called Yehuda, which is the Judean area of Eretz Yisrael, in some places within that area, they had the custom that already during Eruvin, which was the betrothal period, it's a little bit more than an engagement. Halachically, they already have the bond of kiddushin, and therefore it would be forbidden to be with any other person, but they're still not permitted to live together. But one night before the nisuin, and it would really be at the time of Eruvin, they would, the chassan and kala, the bride and the groom, would be miyached together. They would be alone together. There'd be a big suda, and they could, in fact, have relations that night. Whether they did or they didn't is another story, but they could. And the Gemara talks about the halachic nafkaminas that would come up if you have a chassan and kala who already, when they were in Eruvin, had the ability to have sexual relations. The Gemara in Ksubis talks about it in much greater extent. That's on Daf Yud Beis Amud Aleph in Ksubis. And if you look at the Rishonim offer different explanations for this unusual custom. After all, it's definitely not usual practice, and we don't do this practice today. So if you look at the Shita Mekomos, he gives two different reasons. He says that there was something that's also mentioned in the first few blot of Ksubis. In English, it's known as prime noctis. In the ancient world, one of the very strange practices they had is that any young virgin who was getting married would be subject to having to be forced to have intercourse with the local ruler or king if he would so choose. That was his right, and it was called prime noctis. It's a Latin word, and it had persisted through millennia in different cultures and different societies. And in the Gemara, they dealt with this problem and had a lot of challenges associated with it, and the rabbis tried to come up with different ways to avoid detection. Anyway, so the way the Shita Mekomos explains it, there's one of two possibilities here. If she no longer was a basula because they had relations when she was betrothed, so when the government would come and try to investigate, they would say, well, she's no longer a virgin, and then that would take away the incentive for the ruler to do this. Somehow or another, it was the gratification, or maybe even there was some kind of idolatrous quality to to being and getting some kind of power from being with the virgin. I really don't know. It's very hard to go back in time and understand the full implications, but this was a persistent custom that existed in different tribes and in different places of the world. You can look it up. So it's a real thing. In any case, if she's no longer a virgin, the attraction would wear off. That's one pshat that Shita Mikabetzes gives. The other pshat, he says, is since the bond is made between husband and wife through their first experience together, you don't want the first experience to be with some heathen, some Gentile. So if it turns out that she is subjected to having to be forced to be with this ruler, with the hegemon, as the Gemara calls it, then at least she already first had relations with her husband. That's the other pshat that the Shita Mikabetzes says that explains this custom. However, interestingly enough, if you look in Rashi in Yevamos on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, he really seems to be addressing wedding night trauma. He says, they would have the chassan and kala, the bride and the groom, be alone together, kodem knisasan l'chuppah, before their nisuin, kedei libo gaspa, in order that he feel accustomed and he feel bold with her. That's probably a good translation. That so far is a lashon of the Gemara, by the way, and a lashon of the Mishnah. Kolomar, now here's Rashi's interpretation. We all know when Rashi says Kolomar, he's paraphrasing and adding in his pshat. Kolomar, rogil umetzachik ima. He would be accustomed with her and be playful with her. Shelo yehuboshin zemizeh, so they would not be embarrassed of each other. Bevilas mitzvah, with the act of the first act of intercourse. Hilka chayshinan dilmaboil. So therefore, we're worried, we won't go into that over there. The point that Rashi is trying to say is not that they were expected to actually have intercourse. If anything, the general expectation was they wouldn't have had intercourse on that time that they were together during the betrothal. The idea was that they'd feel more comfortable. Let's listen again to Rashi's language of ragil u'metzachik ba. He would be accustomed with her and playful with her. Shelo yeboshin zemizet. They should not be embarrassed of each other when they do the bios mitzvah, which will happen later on at the time of the chuppah. And I think this is a really interesting piece about wedding night trauma. And then, interestingly enough, the Yad Ephraim, who lived in the 18th and 19th century, from 1760 to 1828, in his Tshuva on Yordea Kuf Tzadei Zayin, actually speaks of a contemporary custom of the bride and groom being alone before the wedding, so that to make sure that the wedding is voluntary and that the man sees his wife and is attracted to her and is really choosing to be with her. Very fascinating, because that's certainly something, a custom we don't do. So what's the bottom line of all this? The bottom line is we don't have these customs. However, we do have sensibility. And what we're noticing is that this is not a new idea, wedding night trauma, and being concerned about wedding night trauma. And we must do, as parents, as rabbanim, as educators, we must do whatever we can to forestall wedding night trauma, whether it's through premarital counseling or education or being attuned to the idea that it might not come so easy for couples. We need to work on this, because whether or not we have the custom that they had in Judea, we are human beings and we have similar challenges and problems that we need to do something about.